Morgan Ortagus is joining me now. She is former State Department spokesperson, now founder, CEO at Polaris National Security, polaris-us.org. Morgan, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, thank you. It's great to be on the show.
Let's just start by looking over some of the historical moments that we've been remembering over the last couple of weeks. It's now been more than 23 years since 9/11, just over a decade since the attack at Benghazi, and 3 years since the Biden-Harris botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. That's a lot those are quite a few foreign policy disasters to look back on in history.
Yeah, there has basically been new war or new chaos around the world for every single year of the Biden-Harris administration. And there's a lot of cost to these deterrence failures as well, Scott. It's not just in lives, it's not just in money. I was going to say it's in lives lost. Vice President Harris actually said, she talked about there being no troops not in combat situation around the world. We literally just had troops that were injured in an ISIS raid in Iraq last week. And we also have the U.S. Navy, which of course has our ships being shot at on a weekly basis from the Houthis with ballistic missiles and drones, sophisticated drones. The U.S. Navy is seeing more action towards its ships than it has seen since World War II. And somehow the vice president thinks that our military isn't seeing combat. I don't know if she was lying or just completely uninformed, but somebody should let her know that, yes, our troops around the world, especially in the CENTCOM theater, are in harm's way.
We've got so many naval vessels in the Middle East right now that it's actually weakening our presence in other hotspots around the world.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, we're trying as best we can. I think our military is doing a decent job of trying to pivot and focus on China, focus on the threat there. But, there's trade-offs. There's real-world costs to failing at deterring Putin from invading Ukraine, for example. There's real-world trade-offs, whenever Hamas attacks Israel and kills Israelis and Americans, and then all of a sudden we're forced, because we have not been holding Iran accountable, and we've been getting them billions of dollars in sanctions relief. All of a sudden they're acting, like the terrorist state that they are, and threatening not only our troops, by the way, but our diplomatic facilities in the region as well. Iran is trying to chase us out of the Middle East. They're trying to control and dominate the region from our allies. It's the same thing that Putin would love to do in Europe, and certainly the same thing that Xi Jinping is trying to do in Asia.
We're talking to Morgan Ortagus here on the Scott Sand Show. During the presidential debate, the topic of the Afghanistan withdrawal did come up between Vice President Harris, President Trump. This was something that did begin while you were in the State Department under President Trump, but the Biden-Harris administration failed to execute that withdrawal properly. 13 American troops lost their lives at Abbey Gate 3 years ago. Where did things go wrong, and why is Trump getting the blame from this from some generals that were serving while he was commander-in-chief?
Yeah, I mean, it is. First of all, we have to go back to, let's go back and look at what happened. President Biden had, according to his Afghan envoy negotiator, which, by the way, was the same negotiator that President Trump employed. He testified to the House Foreign Affairs Committee that President Biden had three options. One, he could abide by the deal that Mike Pompeo and President Trump negotiated with the Taliban, which of course was a conditions-based deal, which meant that we left with 2,500 troops there, and there was all these conditions for how you would actually draw down to zero. The Taliban would have to meet those conditions. So Biden actually did not go along with President Trump's plan, as much as they lie about it and claim that they did. So he had the option to keep that plan, try and scrap it and do a new plan, or an option to just, continue to slowly draw down over the next 6 to 9 months and just get everybody out no matter what. That's the option he chose. He didn't choose to create a new deal with the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan. He didn't even choose to abide by President Trump's plan, because if he would have pursued a conditions-based approach. President Biden, and according to Vice President Harris, because she said she was the last one in the room, they were the ones who made the decision that they were pulling all American troops out no matter what. And they in the report is very clear that they failed to properly plan for all contingencies. They failed to plan for what would happen if the Taliban started taking province by province as they did, and even once they did, they were sort of blind. That the report is particularly damning to National Security Advisor Sullivan and to Secretary of State. What's also important is that there was no accountability. I mean, to this day, the Biden and Harris try to act like their withdrawal was, perfectly normal, that was going to happen. We know it wasn't, because obviously there's a number of lives lost. One of the main problems, and I think one of the reasons that this issue has hurt them so much, is because they're just gaslighting the American people. They refuse to hold anyone accountable, and then they tried to act like it was no big deal, when instead it was one of the most shameful and embarrassing things that had ever happened to the United States of America in modern history. So there was a failure to plan, a failure to execute, and a failure to listen. According again to this House Foreign Affairs report, it wasn't just United States generals and even diplomatic leaders that were trying to tell Biden not to pull everybody out to do a conditions-based approach. NATO was as well. NATO was trying to warn Biden and Harris, and they just didn't listen. It's one thing to be stubborn and obstinate and say, I'm doing this no matter what, and I'm going against all of your recommendations. If you're going to do that, at least have your act together and be able to plan and execute a withdrawal, and not getting everybody killed on the way out.
You better,
they couldn't do that.
You better be right, and if you're not, you better own up to it. And I'm certainly no foreign policy expert, but I talk strategy on a lot of different things a lot. And you and I have had this conversation before. I believe that this botched withdrawal 3 years ago directly led to Putin's assertion into Ukraine, to Chinese moving forward to threaten and become more interventionist in Taiwan, to Iran in their involvement in Israel and with their proxies. It's led to this unrest around the world because the Biden-Harris administration screwed up and showed weakness and showed inept command of the military.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, whenever that disastrous and chaotic withdrawal happened, everybody took notes. Our friends, our enemies, dictators, thugs, despots, they made calculations about what they could get away with based off of those decisions. And it has weakened America around the world. And I can tell you that this did not happen in the Trump administration.
We're talking to Morgan Ortagus, former State Department spokesperson and founder CEO at Polaris National Security, polaris-us.org, here on the Scott Sand Show. I found it interesting. I think this is the first presidential debate in 2 decades that has not had some mention of 9/11 in it. And that especially interesting on the eve of 9/11. But the threat of Islamic terrorism, Islamic extremism, is still there. And the red flags, the warning sirens are up because of our porous borders. And we don't know who's coming into this country, into the United States, as our next threat. And at the same time, we're seeing the rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And 5 years later, we're seeing the rise, the resurgence of the Islamic State, of ISIS.
Well, thank you so much for bringing that up. I mean, that's a crucially important point. In Afghanistan, where Biden said, don't worry, we would have over-the-horizon strike capability, ISIS Khorasan, which is the Afghanistan affiliate of ISIS Khorasan has a foothold in every single province in Afghanistan. If you open up the Wall Street Journal today, you can read about how the ISIS resurgence in West Africa is a huge problem. And, oh, by the way, it doesn't help that we were just kicked out of Niger. We had, just really terrible job by our head diplomat for that region. Ended up getting us kicked out of Niger. And by the way, the Russians came to replace us. That's a massive problem. We know, according to public reporting, that there's an ISIS smuggling ring at our southern border. Oh, and we know, by the way, that ISIS is able to stop Taylor Swift concerts in Europe because of their sophisticated planning. So I think, unfortunately, it's back to the future as it relates to ISIS. And if President Trump is elected in November, in January of 25, just like he had to do in January of 17, he's going to have to come in and take off the gloves to go after ISIS yet again.
And hopefully it'll be soon enough, because I got to tell you, I don't think the question is if, but when we'll have another terror attack inside of our own borders.
Yeah, I mean, God forbid, right? I mean, we all hope that is the worst case scenario that won't happen. But it's hard to comprehend how you could have an ISIS smuggling ring at our southern border and it not happen. We know just this week, actually, I think it was, we found out that there was an attempt, a potential attempted attempt against a Jewish center in New York by a Pakistani man. And luckily, thank God, the authorities thwarted that, but they were going to try to shoot up a Jewish center. So, yeah, I mean, there are targets, and the planning is real. The FBI director has testified more than once this year in front of the Congress, where he has warned of flashing and blinking red lights in this country, and has warned of an imminent terrorist attack.
Not to mention the Iranian plot to assassinate Donald Trump, which
I know it's all so bad. It's hard to get to it all, Scott.
I know. I mean, we could talk about these threats all day. We're talking to Morgan Ortagus here on the Scott Sand Show. Foreign policy is not really in the top 3 or 4 concerns for most American voters, but it did come up during the debate. Your thoughts on how Donald Trump and Vice President Harris handled the questions on foreign policy during the debate?
Well, listen, maybe it's just because I'm a foreign policy nerd. I didn't think that there was nearly enough foreign policy questions. In fact, I don't recall a single question about China, which both administrations, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, have said is our biggest geopolitical threat. But yet not a single question about it. I think there was questions about tariffs, which had a little bit of a China component to it, but not a holistic question for, we're in the middle of a new Cold War, an even more dangerous Cold War. And the fact that we're in the middle of that, the fact that there's chaos around the world and China is not even brought up as a single question in 90 minutes. But, they had time for other silly stuff.
Right.
It's just a disservice to the American people.
January 6th and the election fraud and all these things that really, I mean, they did not go well for Donald Trump in having to talk about them, but voters generally don't care about it. 7 minutes on the economy, if that, maybe 7 minutes on the economy total. And that was just malfeasance, malpractice on the part of ABC's moderators. But that's a whole other topic for the rest of the show. Morgan, it's great to have you on. I love having you as a guest, and Polaris-US.org to learn more about Polaris National Security. Thanks, Morgan.
All right. Thank you, sir. Great to be on. Thank you.